Hi, good morning. So thank you for coming online today for another live session. Last week we met through a recorded session, so I hope what we covered last week was clear. We were doing fixed income securities, and the last week's recorded session was the continuation of where we stopped the previous week. Right. So if you have any questions, you can direct them right now. We did fixed income securities. We did calculation of price. Then we went on to computation of duration. The duration measures the interest rate sensitivity of a bond. We also did convexity. So these are two important measures. If you all have no questions, we can move on. The last 2 weeks were quite interesting. The last couple of weeks, we saw the election, the results of the election, and also, so hopefully now the country will start booming, economy will start picking up, hopefully. There's a lot of hope. Also, internationally, we saw Mark Zuckerberg joining the $100 billion club. Right? His net worth has exceeded $100 billion. Right now, $100 billion. The Sri Lankan economy as a whole is only about $85–90 billion. Zuckerberg alone is about $100 billion. Right now, so this shows the capacity a person has if you're thinking out of the box. If you are willing to think out of the box, the potential is immense. Right? Sky is the limit. This is just one guy having a net worth of $100 billion. Right? He just developed a simple app which everyone started using, and see what happened to his net worth. So that's what happens if you all are willing to think out of the box. Right? Okay, so no questions from last week. Right, so we can move on to today's session. Let's start off with asset accounting. Under asset accounting, what you do is, when you buy a treasury bill or a treasury bond, or if you purchase equity, right, your intention may be different. Now, for example, if you buy a treasury bond, your intention at the time of purchase might be to trade. Yeah, so you know what trading is, right? Isn't it? Take, for example, the simplest thing, which most of us are familiar with. You buy shares, right? So you buy, let's say, John Keells. So if you purchase John Keells, if you had purchased it at a price of maybe 115, your intention would be to trade it. Right? So if the price goes up, if it goes to 120, 125, you make a capital gain. Yeah. Also, you might receive dividends at some point. Right? So if your objective is to trade, your objective might be to trade, then you might have a different objective. Now, for example, you might not want to trade John Keells. You might want to have it as a long-term investment, not as a trading portfolio, but a long-term investment. You believe in the potential of John Keells. You believe in the potential of the waterfront project and all that. So you purchase John Keells as a long-term investment, not a investment where you intend to trade and make a short-term gain. Right? Just if you are a value investor, you see potential where the share price will double over a period of maybe 5–6 years. So invest in it with long-term capital appreciation objectives. And so if that is the case, then you might not want to trade. No, that is not your intention. So you might have it under a different category. Right? So the same share you can purchase maybe to trade or to invest long-term. Similarly, you can do the same for bonds, right? So you can buy a 10-year bond, maybe at 7%, with the objective of trading, right? So if you buy bonds, you will gain if interest rates drop. From 7% if you had purchased, if interest rates drop to 6%, you will gain, isn't it? If you look at bond prices, we discussed that the price is inversely related to yield. So if bond prices will increase if interest rates drop, right? So let's say you purchased a bond when the interest rate was 7%. You will gain, for you to gain, the price should increase. The price will increase only if interest rates drop, right? So if interest rates or the yield drops from 7 to 6%, you will make a capital gain. That is how bonds work. Okay, so if you talk in terms of interest rates and bonds, interest rates should drop for you to make a capital gain. Right. So the intention at the time of purchasing a bond might be either to trade or to hold until it matures, right? Or you hold it for a certain period of time, maybe 3-4. It was a 10-year bond. You hold it for 3 or 4 years to sell it, not right now, but somewhere down the line. Right? When you see a potential of selling it, where you can sell it and realize a profit, then you might sell, right? So there are 3 intentions. One is to trade, to only trade, nothing else but trading, right? The second one is to trade, not to sell it off, maybe not right now, but at some point in the future, right? Because you don't have a need to sell it off right now. There is no other place to invest, so you hold it until such time the bond becomes profitable. The third intention is to hold it until it matures. So the 10-year bond, you will hold it for 10 years. You have absolutely no intention of selling, right? So those 3 objectives are there if you purchase a bond. So if those are the objectives, then your classification also should be different. Now think of it as this, in this manner. If a car, right, a simple car, if it's in a car sale, right, a car in a car sale, the objective of the owner of the car sale is to sell it, right? He's not going to use it now. So the objective is to sell, right? So the intention is to sell at that point. Then if you buy a car, or your grandparents buy a car, they don't want to sell it. They will want to use it for as long as possible. No intention of selling, right? For as long as the car is there, they want to keep it. Then if you buy the car, your objective might not be to sell it immediately, but at the right time you will want to sell and buy something you might want to upgrade. Okay, so there are different objectives when we buy assets. Now, based on our objective, the way we classify also will differ. That is what we discuss under asset accounting. How do you classify an asset which you bought with the intention maybe of selling or holding it until it matures? So there are 3 different objectives. So the previous standard that dealt with asset accounting was called IAS 39, which is not used anymore. The latest standard is IFRS 9. Now, just to give you an overview, asset accounting was dealt under IAS 39 under 4 categories. There were 4 categories under IAS 39. The fair value through profit or loss, right, or the trading portfolio, the available for sale, loans and receivables, and held to maturity. There were 4 categories. Now, when it came to IFRS 9, the loans and receivables has been dropped. Right? So there are now only 3 categories. Right? The trading portfolio of it, FVTPL, fair value through profit or loss, the fair value through other comprehensive income, AFS, available for sale, which was under IAS 39, is now categorized as fair value through other comprehensive income, FVOCI, right? And the held to maturity portfolio is still there. So there are now 3 categories instead of 4. Okay, so we will not discuss IAS 39 beyond this point, and we will entirely focus on IFRS 9. Right, so you can skip these slides. This is only for your knowledge that what was covered under IAS 39. Right? It's good to know the little bit of history. Then you will know how these things evolve. It's easier to understand the subject that way. So you know what fair value is, right? It's the value that can be derived from an arm's length transaction in the market. Arm's length transaction. It's called fair value. Okay, so if say someone holds a gun to your head and tries to sell your vehicle, then the value is different. But if you're selling it in the market, you will try and achieve the market price. That's called the fair value, right? So it is the estimate of value of all assets and liabilities of an acquired company used to consolidate the financial statements of both companies. Fair value is used as a certainty of the market value of an asset or liability for which a market price cannot be determined, usually because there is no established market for the asset, right? So it's based on a judgmental basis. Fair value is the amount at which the asset could be bought or sold in a current transaction between willing parties, right? So it is the price that will be traded within two willing parties or transferred to an equivalent party other than a liquidation or sale. Okay, so it's not a forced sale instance. It is a genuine market transaction without any anomalies. Right, so this is the IAS 39 classification, which I mentioned earlier. Now this has been replaced by IFRS 9. So they have a FVPL, fair value through profit or loss, available for sale, loans and receivables, and held to maturity classification. Right. So I have given a detailed description of how these categories worked. Now, the functionality under IAS 39 and IFRS 9 are similar, very, very similar. But there are only subtle differences. Now, for example, loans and receivables has been removed from IFRS 9, right? So these are the four categories under IAS 39. You don't have to study this, just for your knowledge, but it's interesting to read. Okay, so read and understand. Fair value through profit or loss, available for sale. Fair value through profit or loss is where you categorize all the trading items. Everything that was purchased, every asset that was purchased with the intention of trading was categorized under fair value through profit or loss. Remember, this classification is done at the point of purchase, right? You can't buy today and 1 month down the line, you can't say this was FVPL. Or you can't even say this was, you bought it 1 month down the line, you can't say this was for held to maturity. You have to decide at the point of purchase. You can't decide later on what you're going to do with it. And available for sale is if you bought a security with the intention of selling, but not right now, then it's available for sale. You can sell it when the price is right or when you're ready to sell. Loans and receivables. Now, wherever there is no secondary market, now, for example, a fixed deposit or a repo can be classified as LNR, loans and receivables. Held to maturity. You bought with the intention of holding it until it matures. Held to maturity. Right? So that was the IAS 39 classification. Now comes IFRS 9, the new standard. Right? It was there since 2018. For the last 2 years, we have been dealing with this standard only. So let's see what IFRS 9 is. 3 categories under IFRS 9, as I explained. It's trading, FVTPL, FVOCI, fair value through other comprehensive income, and held to maturity. Right. So this is a comparison between. This table shows a comparison between IAS 39 and IFRS 9. You don't have to know the differences, but for your knowledge, it's good that you know what IAS 39 was, right? So that you know the evolution of this accounting standard. Right. Okay. IFRS 9, 3 categories. Fair value through profit or loss. FVTPL. FVOCI, fair value through other comprehensive income. And held to maturity. Right. So these are the three categories. Now the differences between the three categories comes in terms of at the time of sale. Right. At the time of sale, before we get to the time of sale, we'll do all fair value changes. Changes in fair value. How does FVTPL categorize change in fair value? Where does it get recorded? Now, for example, if you had purchased a bond at a price of 90 and the price goes up to 100, how do you recognize the change in price? Right, so bond price, which was purchased at 90, goes to 100. There is an increase of 10. The price has gone up by 10. Now, where do you record the increase in price? Where do you record the increase in price? When it comes to FVTPL, all fair value changes get recorded in, as the name implies, fair value through profit or loss. Right? So it goes, fair value change goes under profit P&L. It goes in the P&L. It hits the P&L straight away. Right? Any fair value change hits the P&L straight away. Because the intention when it comes to FVTPL is to trade. Nothing else but trade. Whereas FVOCI, the intention is not purely trading. Right? It can be to trade, to sell it at some point, certainly, but not right now. Right? You can't buy now and immediately sell. That's not your intention. You buy it today, hold it for a certain period of time, and when you need, when you want to sell, if you see an opportunity of selling, you can sell it. It's categorized as FVOCI. So fair value changes and the FVOCI hits what? Changes in fair value hits the other OCI, other comprehensive statement, comprehensive income statement. It doesn't hit the P&L. Okay. So there is no P&L impact, only an OCI impact. Then what about HTM? HTM assets, how does HTM assets recognize fair value changes? It does not recognize. Fair value changes are not recognized if they are categorized as HTM. Right, so there is no impact on fair value if an asset is categorized. So there is no impact on profit or loss if an asset is categorized as HTM. Right? So any questions up to now? Okay, no questions. Then what happens if we sell? So at the point of sale, on the FVTPL, if you are selling an FVTPL asset, all realized gains or losses will hit P&L. All realized gains and losses will hit the P&L. And if it's OCI, classification is slightly different. Right? If it's a bond, then realized gains or losses hit P&L. Right? So remember, if it's a bond, your realized gain or loss will hit the P&L. But if it's equity, realized gains or loss will hit OCI. Okay, so remember, there is a difference. The treatment is not identical. FVTPL, realized gains and loss will hit P&L. OCI, realized gains and losses, if it's a bond, will hit the P&L, equity will hit other comprehensive income statement. Right? HTM, you are not supposed to sell and realize profit. Right? You are not supposed to sell HTM securities. Okay. Right. So this is what you need to remember. IFRS 9. This is the treatment. This is all that you need to remember. If you know this, you know IFRS 9. It's very simple. Yeah. So I hope that was clear. Right, so no questions, right? The other thing is, if you categorized a security as under one of these three categories, right, either FVTPL, FVOCI, or HTM, you cannot reclassify. That's not allowed. Big no-no. Right? You can't. Now, if you categorized an asset as HTM, for example, right, you can't subsequently say you bought this with the intention of selling, but now you want to sell, so we'll categorize as FVTPL. That is not allowed. Not allowed. And if you do that, every asset under HTM will have to be reclassified as trading. That is the penalty. But a one-time reclassification is allowed. One time for justifiable reasons. And just one time you can do it. Other than that, it's not allowed, right? Now, this is the standard that is adopted by banks. Right? So banks are on IFRS 9. Insurance companies are still using IAS 39. There is some a complete shift has not happened yet, but everyone is encouraged to adopt IFRS 9. For banks, it is a must, compulsory that they use IFRS 9. Okay. Right, so impairment of assets, which is dealt in IAS 39. Now, what do you mean by impairment? Well, if you buy an asset, right, and all of a sudden you find there is a fault in it, some fault, some defect, then the value of that asset is not likely to go up. No, it is actually, in fact, likely to come down, right? So if there is evidence that an asset will lose value, it's called an impaired asset. Right now, For example, if there is an AC which has something wrong with the condenser, the cooler or whatever, right? And it's not functioning properly, then definitely there is something wrong. You can't, if you want to sell it, you can't sell it at the original price. And so the value of that asset has dropped seriously, steep drop. That's called an impairment of an asset. So IAS 36 deals with impairing assets. It applies to all of these assets, right? Even to goodwill, which is an intangible asset. Okay, so IAS 39 is also for your knowledge only, right? You don't have to dig deep into this, just for your knowledge. Interesting standard. These are some of the definitions. Impairment loss, the amount by which the carrying amount of an asset or cash generating unit exceeds its recoverable amount. Right now, in the books, you might have recorded an asset at 100, but the actual asset value might be actually 80. For some reason, the value would have dropped. Right? Reason other than depreciation. It's not the normal depreciation, but some form of a defect in the asset where you cannot get the original value. Right? The carrying amount is the amount at which an asset is recognized in the balance sheet after deducting accumulated depreciation and accumulated impairment losses. Right? So it's actually not the depreciated value, something beyond that. The recoverable amount is the high of assets fair value less cost of disposal, sometimes called net selling price, and its value in use. Right? So the amount that you can recover, now there are two options now. Either you can sell the asset, right? So if you sell the asset, it's the sale price minus whatever the cost you incur, maybe the commissions or advertising cost or whatever. Or if you continue to use the asset, what amount can you recover from it? Right? So it's the higher of the two. Fair value is the price that would be received to sell an asset or paid to transfer a liability in an orderly transaction between market participants at the measurement date. Like we already discussed fair value. The value in use is the present value of future cash flows expected to be derived from an asset or a cash generating unit. Right? So that's the value in use. Now these are only for your information. So how do we identify an asset that may be impaired? At the end of each reporting period, an entity is required to assess whether there is an indication that an asset may be impaired. Are there any indications? So if you look at an asset, right, physical indications, or in performance, if there is an indication. IAS 36 has a list of external and internal indicators of impairment. There is an indication that an asset may be impaired, then the asset's recoverable amount must be calculated. So if you have very clear evidence that an asset may have been impaired, you will have to calculate the recoverable amount. The recoverable amount of the following types of intangible assets are measured annually, whether or not there is an indication that it may be impaired. Hence, in some cases, the most recent detailed calculation of recoverable amount in preceding period may be used in the impairment test for the asset, for that asset in the current period. So remember, well, actually, you don't have to know the standard. It's just for your information. The recoverable amount of the following types of intangible assets are measured annually, whether or not there is an indication that it may be impaired. Right? So these assets you need to test annually. An intangible asset with indefinite useful life, right? So something like goodwill or brand value, indefinite useful life. Then intangible asset not yet available for use. It's something like a software that is being developed. Goodwill acquired in a business combination. So if you purchase an entity, now recently, yesterday we saw Sunshine Holdings purchasing Dainty, right, for a price of $1.7 billion. I think it was some 10 million shares, 100% stake of Dainty had been acquired by Sunshine. Right. So in that case, say the value of Dainty, if it was $1 billion and Sunshine paid 1.7 billion, the additional 700 million will be the goodwill. Yeah. Now, annually, Sunshine will be required to calculate the value of the goodwill, whether there is indication of impairment or not. And that has to be done annually, an annual exercise. Indications of impairment can be either external or internal. External might be the market value drops, sudden drop in market value. Right now, something like Nokia phones. If you all were using Nokia phones several years ago, 10 years ago, if you had the same Nokia today, the market value would have dropped steeply. Right? You would have paid a thumping amount to purchase, but today the market value is down because no one is using. It's not in demand. The negative changes in technology, market, economy, or loss. Right? So there is something negative about it. Technology, like typically what happened to Nokia, no one wants it. Right? It's not as technologically advanced as a Samsung or an Apple. Markets, economy, or law. So maybe during a time of recession, right, people will not want the asset. Then increase in interest rates. If interest rates go up, spending patterns will drop, and not everyone will want the asset. Net assets of the company might be higher than the market capitalization. Right? So market capitalization of, well, it's like the price to book value. Right? Market capitalization to book value. If it's above 1, that means the net assets have increased. Right? So if it's below 1, the price to book value is below 1, means the net asset value is less than, is higher than the price or the market cap. Internal sources can be obsolescence or physical damage. Right? Internal, something internal. There might be sabotage. Yeah? Asset is idle, part of the restructuring or held for disposal. An idle asset. Asset is very good, but in perfect condition, but no one is using it. Idling asset. Might be due to restructuring of an asset, or you want your intention is to sell it off. You don't need it anymore. Worse economic performance than expected, right? You bought a high-tech, high state-of-the-art equipment, but you're not using it. You want to sell it off. For investments in subsidiaries, joint ventures, or associates, the carrying amount is higher than the carrying amount of the investee's asset. The carrying amount is higher than the carrying amount of the investee's assets. So investee's assets, the size of the balance sheet might be less than what you recorded. Now, for example, I'm just throwing out examples. Hypothetical example, Sunshine bought Dainty for 1.7 billion, but it might not be able to record it at 1.7 billion because the net asset value of Dainty might be less. I'm just throwing some numbers. It's not the actual case. So if it's 500 million, then there's an indication of an impairment. Right? Or a dividend exceeds the total comprehensive income of the investee. Right? An investee declares more dividends than the income, then also it has to be impaired, right? So because that excess dividend will have to be funneled through reserves. So the value of the investee will drop. These lists are not intended to be exhaustive. Right? There are further reasons. Further, an indication that an asset may be impaired may indicate that the asset's useful life, depreciation method, or residual value may need to be reviewed and adjusted. Okay, that is IAS 36 and IFRS 9. Okay, so that is asset accounting. Any questions on that? Okay. Right. So if we have no questions, we can move on to the next area. Now, if you make an investment, how do you measure its performance? Performance measurement, very important. Right. So how do you measure performance? That is covered under performance evaluation of portfolio performance. And if you look in newspapers, you might see various asset managers, right? Mainly unit trusts publishing their performance. They will ask investors to come and invest in their fund because their performance, the money market fund is giving a return of X%, right? Or their equity fund is giving a return of Y%, right? So this is advertised heavily. Yeah, and the higher the return, the more attractive it becomes to the investor. Okay. Now, how do these fund managers achieve a certain level of performance? That is what we measure under evaluation of portfolio performance. How do you measure performance from the performance of one fund manager to another fund manager, right? Covered under performance measurement. Performance evaluation improves the effectiveness of a fund's investment policy by acting as a feedback and control mechanism. So remember, performance evaluation acts as feedback and control mechanism. Right? So there is feedback and also control. Why feedback and why control? Now this is an objective of measuring performance. You need feedback and you also need control. Feedback in terms of you should know where the fund is heading, right? The fund manager should have an idea about what is happening to the fund, whether it's going the right direction or the wrong direction. So there should be feedback. Is the fund going to achieve its target return or is it going to fall short? You wouldn't know that if it's not there is no feedback. Or are you going to meet investor expectations, right? So investors, not all investors want returns all the time. Now, when there is high risk in the market, some investors might prefer to invest in safe havens, right? So they might want the fund manager to forget about the return and give their capital back at least. So that should be also the fund manager's objective. Now, the fund manager will not know what the intention of investors are. There is no feedback. And also to control. Right, control mechanism. If the fund manager is deviating from his mandate, now, for example, if he has been given a mandate to invest only in bonds, and if he starts deviating slightly and investing in other instruments, maybe FTs and all that, there can also be a feedback mechanism which controls his actions. Right. So remember, performance evaluation can be used as control as well as feedback mechanisms, or both. Right? It does the following: shows where the policy and allocation is effective and where it is not. Right? Is the fund manager striking the right chords? Is the policy and allocation effective or is it not? Is the desired objective being achieved? Now, if the objective is to achieve, let's say you're benchmarking against the All-Share index return for a year. Right? If the All-Share index is achieving 10% return and your return is 5%, then you have an indication of whether you have done better than the index or worse than the index. Then it directs management to areas of value added and lost. Right? So if you have done better than the market or your benchmark, what have you done better than the market? And what have you done worse than the market? Where can you improve? Right? So it adds value. It directs management to areas of value added and lost. Right? Where have you gained? Where have you lost? Quantifies the result of effective management and other policy decisions. Right? Quantifies results. Right? Now, without quantification, it is difficult to measure the performance. It has to quantify your results in one way or the other. It indicates where other additional strategies can be successfully applied. Right? What other strategies can you use to achieve a performance level beyond expectations? Components of performance evaluation performance measurement to calculate rates of return based on changes in the account's value over specified time period. Right? The performance measurement will calculate the rates of return based on changes in the account's value of a specified period. Right? So the account can be a money market fund. By what amount has it changed for a given 1 year period? That is measured by performance evaluation. Performance attribution to determine the sources of the account's performance, right? What has brought in the good performance? Outperformed. How did it outperform the market? What sources led to the outperformance of markets? Performance appraisal to draw conclusions regarding whether the performance was affected primarily by the investment decisions, by the overall market, or by chance. Right? So a fund manager in a given year might have done extremely well compared to the market. But what was driving the performance? What was it? His genuine ability. The fund manager might have an ability to pick the right investment. Right? He might feel you need to overweight your bond portfolio, underweight equity. Or the opposite, might have to overweight equity, underweight bonds. What was driving the performance? What drove the performance? What was it his skill, the fund manager's skill in picking the right investment? Or was it the overall market, whether it was that fund manager or his grandmother? Would the overall market have increased regardless of where you invested? Right? Whatever asset that you picked would have increased in value. Regardless of what happened, which asset you picked, it was the market that was driving. It was not your stock or instrument picking ability. Right? It was just the market, nothing to do with the fund manager. Or was it luck, pure luck? Huh? Now, maybe there was a pure luck, like for example, the fund manager had to exit an investment, let's say, because there was a need for liquidity, right? So he had to sell some of his bonds or debentures. If he had sold this debenture and all of a sudden that debenture defaulted after the fund manager sold, then it is pure luck. Not that he wanted to sell, but he was forced to sell for a liquidity need. Right? That is called luck. That was not his performance or his stock, his ability to pick good investments, but pure luck. So these are the return components. A portfolio return can be broken up into 3 components: a market, style, or active management. Right? Performance will be driven through these 3 components: the market component, the style component, and the active management component. Now, out of performance, right? So let's say a portfolio gave a return of 15% return for a given year, right? 15% return. Now, this 15% return, how was it achieved? Was it through market factors? Maybe the market increased by 10%. Then was it due to style? Right? Style is the fund manager's style. How does he invest? Is he more towards fixed income or is he more towards equity? And active management, right? So if within his style, how is he actively managing? How is he faring against a benchmark? That's called active management. So the first one is performance equals market, style, active management. Right? It's a combination of these 3 factors, the total of these 3 factors. Performance, P is the investment manager's portfolio return. M is the return on the market index. How is the market doing? Style is the benchmark minus the market return. Excess return, S is equal to B minus M. Right? Excess return due to style is the difference between the manager's style index or the benchmark and the market return. S can be positive or negative. Right? So style, if you have done better, if the market has done better than the benchmark, then style can be negative. But if the market has not done as well as the benchmark, style can be positive. A, which stands for active management, is the portfolio return minus the benchmark return. Active return is the difference between managers' overall portfolio return and the style benchmark return. Right? So let's try this example. Example. Let's try this. Take 2 minutes and try the example. It says the Pallister account has a total monthly return of 5.04%. During the same period, the portfolio benchmark returned 5.32%, and the market index returned 3.92%. The portfolio benchmark, the benchmark was 5.32, Pallister returned 5.04, and the market had done 3.92. Calculate the amount of the portfolio return attributable to the manager's active management and style. Actually, all you have to do is use that equation and calculate. Let's do it. So what are the answers you all got? You can type in your answers. Give it some thought. An interesting question, right? So if you're a fund manager and you have made a return of 5.04, right, whereas the market has returned 3.92, then obviously you have done better than the market. But the benchmark has done 5.32, so you have not achieved your benchmark. The benchmark had done better than you. If that is the case, you asked to calculate the portfolio return attributable to managers, active management, and style. What return was attributable to style and what return is attributable to active management? That is the question. Right, so let's give it a try. All you need to do is use this equation. P equals MSA, SC equals BM, A equals P minus B. Troy Gerald, so, and Vishwa. Style is 1.4. Active management, negative 0.28. Good. How about the others? Right, I'll give you 1 more minute to try. So let me repeat the question. This particular account has had a total monthly return of 5.04, right? So if you are the fund manager of this account, you have made a return of 5.04. The portfolio benchmark, right? You're benchmarking against a certain portfolio. Maybe if you are the fund manager, you might benchmark against the EPF return generated by EPF. The benchmark has done 5.32. So you have done 5.04. Your benchmark has done 5.32. So which means the benchmark has done better than you. And the market index 3.92, right? But the market has done 3.92. So you're about 1.12% above market. Okay, and 0.28% below the benchmark. You're asked to calculate the amount of the portfolio return attributable to active management and style. I just simply use those equations. Yeah, okay, so let's discuss. The Pallisk account has total monthly return 5.04. So the equation you need to do is P equals MSA. P is the portfolio return, is the market, style, and active management returns, right? Then S is equal to the benchmark minus the market return. Style is equal to benchmark minus market return. Active return, P. Active return is equal to portfolio return minus the benchmark return. So these are the three equations. You can bet on these three equations. According to this question, the portfolio had a total monthly return of 5.04. Portfolio return 5.04%, isn't it? Now this 5.04% was achieved due to these three factors: due to the market return, due to style, and due to active management. During the same period, the portfolio benchmark, returned 5.32. And market returned 3.92. Market was 3.92. So this is the information that has been given. We have been given the portfolio return, the benchmark return, and the market return. Now, using these three factors, calculate the amount of the portfolio return attributable to managers' active management style, active management, and style. Right? So that is the question. Now, style return is the benchmark. return due to style is the benchmark minus market. Okay, so benchmark is 5.32 minus the market 3.92. Return due to style is 1.4%. Okay. Then active management. Portfolio return 5.04 minus benchmark 5.32. So it's negative 0.28. Yeah. So I hope this is clear. Right, now you have beautiful answers. Okay. How to interpret these answers? How do you interpret? First one is very easy. His portfolio has returned 5.04. Very clear. But the portfolio return was due to these factors. Due to the market being 3.92, market has done 3.92%. Style is 1.4%. And his active management has decided negative 0.28%. Right? So the 5.04 was achieved by the market doing 3.92%. The overall market has done 3.92%. Fantastic. Then his style, right? What kind of a manager is he going after? Is he focused on equity? Or is he focused on fixed income? That is the style. What style is he adopting? What is his fund management style? Is he long-term or short-term? That is the return due to style. He has generated 1.4% because his style was good. He has adopted the right style. But within that, actively managing against the portfolio, he has not done that well. And he has lost something. He has lost 5.32. Sorry, he has lost 0.28. Benchmark has done 5.32. He has done 5.04. So he has lost 0.28%. Now his active management is where the weakness is. This is where the weakness lies in active management. Right? So this is how the feedback works. You can tell the guy that yes, your style is fine, fantastic. You are adopting the right style. Keep it up. But within the style, your active management has generated negative 0.28, right? Compared to the benchmark. So you have done better than the market, but less than the benchmark. Now, why? What caused the drop? What caused the 0.28% drop? Maybe the benchmark had the portfolios they had, right? So if it was an equity-driven strategy, the benchmark may have had banks, overweight banks in the sector, in the benchmark, whereas the Pallister guy may have overweighted hotels, like overweighted on hotels. So that didn't work. Hotels has not done well, and on the other hand, the benchmark, which had banks overweight, may have done well. Right? So that would have caused the drop in performance due to active management. He was actively managing, but he had not picked the right stocks. Okay. So that is how this works. Performance evaluation is done in this manner. I hope it was clear. Any questions on this? Right, so we can move on. Benchmark. Right, now what is a benchmark? Everyone talks of benchmarks. When you all were small, when you all are big adults, you all almost always have a benchmark, isn't it? Whom do you benchmark against, and what should be the qualities of that person or the index? A benchmark is a standard against which the performance of security, a mutual fund or investment manager can be measured. Right? So it is a standard against which you measure performance. Generally, broad market and market segment stocks and bond indices are used for this purpose. Right, now maybe your benchmark might be the all share price index. Benchmark properties of a benchmark, it has to be specified in advance. Right. So benchmarking you can't do after the year end. You have to give it at the beginning of the year. This is your benchmark, and this is the target you are expected to meet. That has to be given at the beginning. You can't do it at the end of the year. Right? End of the year, you can't say, sorry, this was not your benchmark. Your benchmark was not the 1 year treasury bill rate. It was the ASPI. Right? That is not done at the end of the year. At the beginning, you have to specify. It has to be appropriate. Right? It has to fit the purpose. The benchmark is consistent with the manager's investment approach and style. So if he's more towards equity, the benchmark should be an equity index, like the all share index. Or if he's doing bonds, maybe the 1 year treasury bill rate at the beginning of the year. Measurable. Its value and return can be determined on a reasonably frequent basis. Right? You have to be able to measure the portfolio's return. Unambiguous. Clearly defined identities and weights of securities constituting the benchmark. You can't have doubts. No doubt about the benchmark. Right? It has to be crystal clear what your benchmark is. Right? So if you say the all share price index, there is no doubt what it is. To be more specific, you should say all share price index. The performance of all share index during 2020 will be your benchmark. Right? So there is absolutely no doubt. Reflective of the manager's current investment options. Now, if the all share price index has assets which you cannot invest in, then it is not very reflective. It might not be the ideal benchmark. Accountable. The manager should accept the application, right? He should accept responsibility for his performance. He should own up to it. He should own up to it. Investable. It is possible to replicate the benchmark and forego active management. If you want, you can stop active management and replicate the benchmark. It has to be investable. Constructing benchmark. Identify the important elements of the manager's investment process. What is the investment process? How do you evaluate your investment options? Select securities that are consistent with that process. Right. So if your process deals more with equity, you should select securities that are consistent with equity. Right. So if your strategy is equity, you should go after bonds. It has to be equity driven. Weigh the securities, including cash, to reflect the manager's process. Right. Based on the volume. Review and adjust as needed to replicate the manager's process and results, and rebalance the custom benchmark on a predetermined schedule. So if you want, you can rebalance and replicate the index. Okay, so that is performance evaluation. Any questions on this? Before we move on to the next area, any questions? All right, so no questions. Let's move on. To budgeting. Right, so what is budgeting? Until I clean the board, can you all tell me? Just type what do you understand by budgeting? What do you mean by budgeting? And who gets involved in budgeting? Nagaleshwaran, it's the planned estimate on revenues and expenses. Fantastic. Yes. It is an estimate, right? Also, it is planned. Very good, Nagalesh. Meaning, if you are budgeting, that is actually your plan. Right? So, now, for example, let's say you want to make a profit of 15 billion next year. Your company is targeting a 15 billion profit next year, right? So the profit target is very clear. Direction is very, very clear. 15 billion profit. How do you achieve the 15 billion profit? What should your revenues be? What is the top line going to be? What is the bottom line going to be? That you know the bottom line is 15 billion. 15 billion bottom line. To achieve the 15 billion bottom line, what should your revenues be? Right. Based on the revenue, what should the cost? Whatever happens, the net should be 15 billion. That is the plan. 15 billion budget. How are you going to achieve? That is what it means. Very good. A budget is a document that translates plans into money that will need to be spent to get planned activities done, and money that will need to be generated to cover the costs of getting the work done. Right? So what are the expenses that have to be incurred, and what are the revenues that the expenses incurred will generate? Right? That is your plan. Your plan. It is an estimate of informed guesses about what will be needed in monetary terms to do work. An estimate or informed guesses about what will be needed in monetary terms to do work, right? So it is an estimate. It is not the actual amount, only an estimate. Also, informed guesses. How do you make informed guesses? Using previous experience or using an industry expert about what will be needed in monetary terms to do work. The process of financial planning is known as budgeting. Financial planning process is called budgeting, right? So that is what the budgeting process means. Financial plan. A budget is an essential management tool. Now, how can a budget be a management tool? How can a budget be a management tool? What do you all think? How can a budget be a management tool? What does a budget do? Can you type in some answers? What roles will a budget play in an organization? What is the importance of a budget? Why can't you run without a budget? Cost management. Very good, Pratham. Managing your costs, right? Fiscal policy of government budget is very useful. Yes, absolutely. When it comes to governments, they do have to manage their finances. Fiscal policy of a government, the revenues and expenses of a government, very important. A critical aspect which can either make or break a nation. Now, if you are having a budget deficit, for example, the government can then plan, or even an organization. It applies to anything. Maybe a government, an organization, or even an individual. Right? Each of us need to do our own budget. Now, if you take yourselves, and if I may ask the question whether you all have ever done budgeting, some of you might say no, which is not correct, right? Because let's say you're going from home to work, office, right? So how much of money will you carry? Will you carry 10 million bucks and travel from home to office by bus? Assuming it's very safe, will you carry 10 million bucks and go to office every day? And you always have 10 million bucks at your disposal. Will you do that? The answer is a clear no. Why? Because you don't need that. No, you just need your bus fare and something to buy lunch. So you'll only carry a nominal amount, maybe 500,000 bucks or 1,000 rupees. Right? It's a small amount. That is because you have already done the budgeting process in your mind. You know what are the expenses you're going to meet. Right? So you carry enough money to meet those expenses or a sudden urgent need. Nothing beyond that. You have budgeted. Every day you're budgeting. Remember that. Every day you're budgeting. Right? So all of you are masters of budgets. This is not a new subject or not a new topic. You already know. So this is just cut and polish what you already know. Budgeting is nothing new. It applies to an individual, to an organization, as well as to government. And so if you are from an individual point of view, if you see that you are short of some money, and you're planning to buy a piece of land or a vehicle, and you're short of money, right? The vehicle cost you 5 million bucks, you have 3 million, you're short of 2 million. How do you bridge the gap? That is the budgeting process, right? You might plan several things. You might maybe plan to liquidate some of your investments. Or you might plan to take a loan, right? Borrow money. Maybe you might plan to invest some money in the stock exchange because you have time to exit and you try to gain some money, right? You have, if you're planning to buy it 6 months down the line, maybe you have some time to invest somewhere and earn a return. So these factors can be looked at. Then when you exit, which investment do you exit first? Do you exit the most profitable or the least profitable? And so these are some of the things that you can plan beforehand when you know what your future expenses and revenues are going to be. Right? So it is a plan. A budget is nothing but a financial plan, okay, which every one of us is doing, whether we work for an organization or not. We always make plans. Right? So benefits of budgeting. Budgets will set targets. Right? Now, the previous example that we did on the board, the budget will say you need a target of 15 billion profit. You need to target a profit of 15 billion rupees. Right? There is no reason why you should fall short. Your target should be met. You should meet the 15 billion target. Budget are measures of how much money is needed to carry out activities. Now, for you to achieve this 15 billion bucks, the bottom line of 15 billion, what are the activities you need to carry out, right? So that means you need a top line of maybe 100 billion top line, and total cost of 85 billion, you will end up with a profit of 15 billion. Now, for you to achieve this 100 billion top line, what are the costs that need to be incurred? Maybe marketing expenses of X, right? Marketing expenses need to be met. The staff training. You have to give training to your staff so that they get better, they get motivated. That will also cost you money. You have to have an amount for that also. Right? Then other additional costs, maybe you have to have knowledge sharing sessions among staff, or you have to have brainstorming session. Then all these factors need to be looked into, right? So what is the process, or what are the wheels within wheels that have to turn for you to achieve your bottom line of 15 billion? Then budgets are a form of communication, isn't it? Without a budget, you don't know where you're heading. So if you have a common goal for the organization, 15 billion profit figure, that is the communication that you do, right? You tell each and every employee. The way you tell might be different, might be an email, or you might have you might brief the head of departments, who will then brief the staff, and you can simply explain that your profit target for the year is 15 billion. You need to achieve the 15 billion. To achieve the 15 billion, these are the plans that has been, measures that have been taken, and these are the things that each and every department has to do. Right? So that a budget can act as a form of communication. Employees are aware of performance expectations with regards to the individual work areas. Budgets act as a monitoring, coordinating, and controlling tool. Right? Monitoring, coordinate, and controlling tool. So budgets will play these roles. They monitor, coordinate, and control. By doing a variance analysis, the manager can estimate where actual results are different from the budgeted results. Right? Because they act as monitoring, controlling, and coordinating tools, you can do variance analysis. That means you compare the actual performance against the budget. That's called the variance analysis. Right? So if the variance is positive, that means you have done better than the budget. If it's negative, you have done worse than the budget. Right? You haven't achieved your budget. So if you have done better than the budget, and if you have done worse than the budget, the reasons have to be looked into. Now, just because you have done better than the budget, you can't forget about it and move on. You have to drill down and find out the reasons, for many reasons. Right? One is, now if you have done better than the budget, it might be that you have done something really, really good, something you may have been thinking out of the box, and your strategy is appealing to a certain segment, maybe to customers or to staff. That has worked for you. Right? So what have you done right? What is this thing that you have done right to achieve such a performance? That has to be looked into. Or maybe you have cooked the books, like the staff members might be taking you for a ride. It might not be the actual picture. That also has to be looked into. There might be something wrong. You gave them unrealistic target, they have done better than the target. Something might be wrong. There might be something fishy. Right? This is also possible. So good performance also has to be monitored. Excuse me. Now, if you all could remember Nick Leeson, right, at Barings Bank, the guy we discussed at the first on the first day, Nick Leeson was continuously outperforming his benchmark. And no one looked into the reason. Right? Why was Nick Leeson doing so well? No one was aware. He just got handsome fat bonuses, took them home, but no one was actually aware of what was going on. And we all know what happened to Barings Bank after that. Right? So that is, he has done better than the benchmark. Nick Leeson had done better than the benchmark, but he was doing fraud. He was committing a fraud, daylight robbery, but still better than the benchmark. No one monitored. That was the mistake they made. No one monitored. Right? So that is where things went wrong for Barings Bank. So good performance as well as poor performance should be monitored. Now, if it's poor performance, the importance of monitoring is you will know why the poor performance was achieved. Maybe the right resources were not given for that particular department. Right? They needed 25 staff, you had only 5. No chance they're going to achieve it. Right? So you know the reason as to what caused the poor performance. Or again, it might again be lack of training for the staff. The staff needs the skill level of so much, but they don't have the skills, and the company, the organization has not taken any steps to give them the skills as well. Okay. So budgets act as a monitoring, coordinating, and controlling tool. By doing variance analysis, the manager can estimate the actual results are different from budgeted results. So it's important that you do your variance analysis. It aids to the planning process by providing a series of quantitative guidelines which can be followed to achieve organizational objectives, right? So your objectives can easily be or your goals, quantification of goals. Now, everyone says goals need not be quantified, but it's good to quantify goals as well. Quantifiable goal, you know where you're heading, no? Right? So it helps the planning process, and it can quantify guidelines which can be followed to achieve organizational objectives, right? So to achieve a bottom line of 15 billion rupees, you might know that your organization needs a critical mass in terms of customers of 25 million. No, sorry, what am I saying? Of 5 million customers. Right? You need 5 million customers. You already have 4 million. How are you going to get the additional 1 million? What are the strategies you're going to adopt to acquire for customer acquisition? Increase customer base by 20% over a period of 1 year. Right? Likewise, you can drill down. What is the marketing plan going to be? How much of resources are you going to allocate? What is the HR plan going to be? The budget forces rigorous thinking through the implementation of activity planning. There are times when the reality of budgeting process forces to rethink action plans. Right, so you might have, it might force the staff to think out of the box. They might not operate within the comfort zones. They might have to deviate from their comfort zones and think out of the box if they are to achieve this objective. So it forces rigorous thinking. Traditional thinking might not be useful. You might have to have rigorous thinking through the implications of activity planning. There are times when the realities of the budgeting process forces to rethink action plans, right? So it can bring out the best in employees. It can motivate employees. Use properly, budget tells when certain amounts of money will be needed to carry out activities, right? You can tell exactly when you want money to carry out a particular activity. Right? So your cash flow planning can also be better. You don't have to prematurely uplift your investments if you have to invest in a particular budget. The budget enables monitoring income and expenditure and identify problems. That's all. Income and expenses can be monitored, and you can identify what are the problems there are. The budget is a basis for financial accountability and transparency. Now, if a particular department has exceeded their budget, then you can pull out the head of the department and get him to explain what caused the deviation. Why is there a deviation? It is also transparent, right? You have to come out with an explanation, justify the deviation, right? And if it's not valid, he may have to reverse and get in line with the budget. When everyone can see how much should have been spent and received, they can ask informed questions about discrepancies. Okay, so it's another very important aspect of budgeting. Limitations of budgeting. Now, in any organization, what kind of staff members do you think will get involved in the budgeting process? Is it the senior most management or is it someone junior? Well, actually, it's always the senior management who gets involved. Right? From the CEO to the corporate management will be involved in the budgeting process. It's not given to junior staff because budget is a critical element of an organization. Budgeting is a time-consuming and costly job, right? So it involves the senior management, and it cannot be done in 5-10 minutes. It has to be done over a period. Sometimes it takes you months and months of planning to get a budget done, right? You can have months and months of planning, which will cost you a lot of time and money. So a lot of time and money of the entire senior management team will have to be spent to do the budget. So it costs time and money. Then you can make many assumptions because you're trying to foresee the next 1 year. Your assumptions might change. Now, classic example is what happened this year. I think last year's budget in each and every organization is irrelevant. No one planned for COVID-19. Right? So whatever assumptions you made last year is all invalid. You may have to redo your budgets for this year. Have fresh targets, right? So budget makes so many assumptions and all of a sudden they may be invalid. Yeah. So the assumptions that are made in the budget might not hold. That's also a drawback of a budget. It's based on assumptions. These budgeted assumptions might not always hold. They might change. Classic example is, as we discussed, this year's COVID-19. Okay, so if you get everything right, everything goes to plan, all your assumptions are correct. If you assume that the dollar exchange rate, the dollar rupee will be stable at around current levels, it might be correct, right? It might be correct. But still, you might not be able to achieve your budget. There might be other reasons. Now, for example, if your assumption, if you're an importing company, your assumption is that the dollar rupee will not change, the assumption is valid, but you might not be able to generate business because imports have been restricted. So if you are one of the companies that came under those categories, your import might have been restricted. Although your assumption that the exchange rate is going to be stable is correct. Right? In that case, you again will not be able to achieve budget. Right? So if you have a perfect budget and everything goes to plan, you achieve the 15 billion, that's also good. But end of the day, what really matters is how much you actually generated. Right? So it costs a lot of time and money. But it's good. It's a good tool to have to allocate resources. You know where you need to head, and you will also know how you need to get there. Budgets also cause a great deal of waste and behavioral problems. Right? Lots of waste and behavioral problems. Waste in terms of time and money, yes. Also resources. Right? Now, for example, some units or some departments might be given X number of resources. But there is no guarantee that all the resources will be used efficiently. We are assuming that each and every resource is going to be used at its best possible capacity, which might not be the case. So there can be lots of waste. Behavioral problems, if you allocate a certain percentage of your resources to the sales department, then the marketing department might be disappointed, or the finance department might be disappointed. Right? So there might be behavioral issues that arise in an organization based on budgetary allocations, right? So some departments might feel they were hard done by. They are not being treated fairly. People's main goal is to meet budgets, so they always try to negotiate to get lower targets with lower sales and higher costs. Right? Now, generally, most often, budgets are prepared so that there will be upside potential. Actual performance you might feel that the actual performance is going to be better, but nevertheless, you keep your budgets low and the costs high. low sales, higher cost, so that it is easier to achieve, which are well known and padding the budget. Right. So your target, you might intentionally make it easier. If not for the budget, you might have gone not 15 billion profit, but 20 billion. But the budget limits your thinking at 15 billion. It doesn't push you to achieve the 20 billion. There are two main budgeting techniques: incremental budgets and zero-based budgets. Incremental and zero-based. Incremental budget is a simple process where you add a percentage to last year's actual performance. Incremental budgets are budgets in which figures are based on those of the actual expenditure for the previous year, with a percentage added for inflation or increase for the next year. This is an easy method that saves time and preparation cost, but it is a lazy way and it is often inaccurate. Right? Very simple. Last year, if you spent $100 and you earned revenues of 120, this year you add 10% on top. And you say inflation was 10%, so you need a 10% adjustment. So revenues will increase by 10%, cost will also increase by 10%. It's easy to do, but usually inaccurate. It prevents conflicts between departments since a consistent approach is adopted through the organization, right? So there is no conflict. Sales guys will not say their targets are impossible compared to objectives of marketing department, right? Because there is consistency. Everyone will get the same treatment. The impact of changes can be seen and traced quickly. Changes can be easily monitored and traced. The budgeting technique is only suitable for organizations where each year is very similar to the previous one in terms of activity. Right? It only fits if the organization or the operating environment is not very dynamic. If it's dynamic, it's not easy. Now, for example, incremental budget might be suitable for banks. At each and every year, you have the same set of products, maybe the same set of customers, so you might use incremental budgets. But if you're dynamic, like maybe an IT sector, right, or you're developing an app, then it might not be correct to use incremental budgets. It assumes that all current activities and costs are still needed without examining, justify them in detail. Now, for example, organizations still purchase newspapers, the physical newspaper, whereas they don't use e-versions. Right? So you might assume that the newspaper, physical newspaper, is still required. When you buy the physical paper, you need storage space to keep those old ones. All that also is there. Very few dynamic organizations or projects are so stable that this budgeting technique really works for them. So very few organizations are stable that this really works. Well, actually, in actual fact, not all operating environments are stable. There is no incentive to try and reduce cost. Performance targets are often unchallenging. Right? And just because you reduce cost, you are not going to be rewarded because you have been given an allocation to increase your cost up to the budgeted amount. Just because you save, you might not benefit. Okay, so let's try this example. Bank will have a sizable amount in its budget for staff salaries. In one particular year, staff salaries were 1.5 billion. When the budget is being prepared for the next year, the CEO thinks that he will need to employ 2 senior managers who will be paid a salary of 500,000 each month before any pay rises, and also that he will need to give all staff members a pay increase of 10%. Assuming that 2 new staff will receive the increased pay levels, calculate his budget for staff salaries. Okay, so let's try this example. A bank will have a sizable amount in its budget for staff salaries. In one particular year, staff salaries were 1.5 billion. The CEO thinks that he will need to employ 2 senior managers who will be paid a salary of 500,000 each month. Okay. So let's work in millions. He needs 2 senior managers, 500,000 each month for 12 months, which will cost 12 million per year. Right. So 2 senior managers, 500,000 each month for 12 months will cost you 12 million each year. That he will need to give all staff members a pay increase of 10%. 10% increase comes to 1,650 million. $13.2 million. It's 1,512 million. Yes. Okay, right. So I hope that was clear. Any questions? Zero-based budgeting is the next area, right? So incremental budgets. Now what we just did is called incremental budgeting. It's based on this year's figure, actual figure, and you add an increase for next year. The next type of budgets are called zero-based budgets. Zero-based, that means unlike incremental budgets where you add an increase to last year's figure, in zero-based budgets, you don't do that, right? You start everything from zero. Unless you can justify, you get an allocation of zero. That's called a zero-based budget. Your base, you're starting from zero. For you to earn every cent, you have to justify why you need to incur every cent. If you can't justify, there is no allocation. In zero-based budgets, past figures are not used as a starting point. Right? If you're using a zero-based budget, you can't use the past figures as starting point. The budgeting process starts from scratch. That's the most important thing. It's not based on the past. It is based on zero. That's why it's called zero-based budget. With the proposed activities for the year, the result is a more detailed and accurate budget, but it takes more time and energy to prepare a budget in this way. Right, so zero-based budget might be a lot more accurate. You are not just using last year's actual to compute a budget for this year. No. It takes more time and energy to prepare a budget in this way. Right? So more time, more effort is required to prepare a budget in this manner. This technique is essential for new organizations and projects, but it is also probably the best route to go in dynamic organizations that is proactive in taking on new challenges. Right? So it's not as easy as an incremental budget, but it is probably better than an incremental budget. Every departmental function is reviewed comprehensively. So you have to look at every department in detail, with all expenditure requiring approval rather than just incremental expenditure requiring approval. So everything you do when it comes to zero-based budgeting has to be justified. Why are you doing this? If you do this, what are the costs? And if you don't do it, what is the cost? Are there any other approaches to do it? Is this the best way of doing it? Right? All these sort of questions will be asked. Zero-based budgeting tries to achieve an optimal allocation of resources to the parts of the business where they are most needed. Optimal allocation of resources will be tried under zero-based budgeting by forcing managers to justify every activity in their department. Until they do this, the budget for the department is zero. So if you can't justify any activity, your allocation is absolutely zero. You are not going to get anything. Right. So everything has to be justified. Remember, that is the difference between incremental and zero-based. A questioning attitude is developed by management, who are constantly forced to ask themselves questions such as, is the activity really necessary at all? You have to do this. Is it a must? What happens if the activity ceases? Why can't you stop this, right? Or can't you do something else? Is the current level of provision adequate? Do you have enough provisions? What other ways are there of carrying out the activity? Is there any other way of doing it? How much would the activity cost? Do the benefits to be gained from the activity at least match the cost? Right. So if you do this, what additional revenue can you bring in? All of these questions are largely answered by breaking the budget process down into 3 distinct stages. Right. In a zero-based budget, past figures are not used as a starting point. The budgeting process starts from scratch with proposed activities for the next year. The result is a more detailed, accurate budget. Sorry, I went the wrong way. All of these questions are largely answered by breaking the budgeting process down into 3 distinct stages. Activities are identified. The first stage, activities are identified by managers, and managers are often forced to consider different ways of performing activity. Right? You can't go down the beaten track. You have to think out of the box. Look around you. How different can you do the same activity? These activities are then described in what is called a decision package, which analyzes the costs of the activity, states its purpose. You're analyzing the cost of the activity, right? What is the purpose of this? So you're buying newspapers, physical newspapers. Why are you buying physical newspapers? What is the purpose? To stay abreast of markets. Your traders need to know what is going on in markets. Can't you use the internet? Identifies alternative methods of achieving the same purpose using the internet. Establish performance measures for the activity. By what amount can you cut down newspaper costs? Assess the consequence of not performing the activity at all, or of performing it at different levels. What happens if you buy papers only every Monday? You cut down, you were previously ordering 5 papers, now you cut it down to 1. Representing the minimum level of service or support needed to achieve the organization's objectives. Further incremental packages means then be prepared to reflect the higher level of service or support. And so you can build on it. While some form of cost-benefit analysis may be useful at this stage, a degree of quantitative analysis must also be incorporated. The second stage, management will then rank all packages in order of decreasing benefits to the organization, right? So each and every department will be asked to justify their cost, and based on the importance to the organization, they will be ranked. This will help management to decide what to spend and where to spend it. And because your resources, your availability of funds is also limited, then you can decide where to spend and what are you going to spend this on. This ranking of the decision package happens at numerous levels of the organization. Should the senior managers be recruited? Right. Now, in the previous example that we just did, they were planning to recruit 2 senior managers. If it was zero-based budgets, the question that would have been asked is, are these 2 required? Can't you manage with existing workforce? Resources are then allocated based on priority. And you then allocate resources based on the priority. You have a priority order. So the highest priority will get the maximum resources. All the resources they need will be given. And then you come to the second priority. Likewise, you come down. And you don't start from bottom and go up. Benefits of zero-based budgets. Now, compared to incremental budgets, zero-based budgets have definite benefits, right? Without justifying, you don't get an allocation. So that means budgeted allocations are given only where it is needed. That is a very clear, distinctive benefit, advantage of zero-based budget. The benefits of zero-based budgets are substantial. They would have to be otherwise. No organization would ever go through lens and detailed above in order to implement it. Well, these benefits are set out below. Since zero-based budgets does not assume the last year's allocation of resources is necessarily appropriate for the current year, all of the activities of the organizations are re-evaluated annually from a zero base. Right? So you're not just replicating what you did last year, this year, because things may be dynamic, things may have changed. You might have to do things differently. It's just not a carbon copy of last year. Most importantly, therefore, inefficient and obsolete activities are removed. Inefficient, wasteful activities are removed, and wasteful spending is curbed. You don't spend unnecessarily. This has to be the biggest benefit of zero-based budgeting compared to incremental budgeting, and was the main reason why it was developed in the first place. Right. By its nature, it encourages bottom-up approach to budgeting in order for zero-based budgeting to be used in practice. This should be encouraged and motivate employees. Right. It challenges the status quo and encourages a questioning attitude amongst managers. Right. It will challenge you from top to bottom. You have to think differently when you're doing zero-based budgets. It responds to changes in business environment from one year to the next. So if the environment is dynamic, you can't just have incremental budgets. You need to have zero-based budgets. So overall, it should result in more efficient allocation of resources. So resources are put to the best use. There is no compromise. Drawbacks of zero-based budgets. Departmental managers may not have the necessary skills to construct decision packages. They will need training for this, and training takes time and money, right? So you might have to train your guys on zero-based budgets. It might actually happen because they should be able to think out of the box now. Thinking out of the box sometimes might not come naturally. They have to be trained. In large organization, number of activities will be so large that the amount of paperwork generated from zero budgets will be unmanageable. The activities will be numerous activities. So many activities in a large organization. Right? If it was a flat organization with very few layers, then it might be more simpler to implement zero-based budget. But if it was, say, a government organization, so many approval lines, right? Lines of approvals from ministries, from the board of directors to departmental approvals, all these are very complicated. So might not be possible. Ranking the packages can be difficult since many activities cannot be compared on the basis of purely quantitative measures. Qualitative factors need to be incorporated, but this is difficult. Top-level management may not have the time or knowledge to rank what could be thousands of packages. This problem can be somewhat alleviated by having a hierarchical ranking process whereby each level of managers rank the packages of managers who report to them. So how can you weed out what is essential, what is not essential? The simple thing like a newspaper might be essential. You never know, right? There might be news which is captured only in the newspaper but not anywhere else. So how can a person sitting above you decide whether you should cut down on newspapers or not? The process of identifying decision packages and determining their purpose, cost, and benefit is massively time-consuming and costly. And the benefits might not be worth the cost. One solution to do this problem is to use incremental budgeting every year and then use zero-based budgeting every 3 to 5 years. So you can go on that basis. You don't have to do zero-based budget every year, but every other year or every 3 to 5 years. Or when major changes occur, this means that an organization can benefit from some of the advantage of zero-based budget without an annual time and cost implication. So you can use a hybrid approach. Another option is to use zero-based budget for some departments, but not for others. Certain costs are essential rather than discretionary, and it could be argued that it is pointless to carry out zero-based budgets in relation to these. For example, electricity cost in a bank are expenses that will have to be paid. Irrespective of the budget amount allocated to them, incremental budget would seem to be more suitable for costs like these, with building repair costs, right? So for certain activities, you can use zero-based budget. For others, you can use incremental budget. Since some decisions are made at budgeted time, managers may feel unable to react to these changes that occur during the year. This could have been detrimental effect on the business if it fails to react to emerging opportunities and threats. Right, so in spite of the budget being there, you can't be too rigid. So you might think an activity is not necessary for a given year, so you don't have to spend on it. You can cut it down, zero allocation for that. But during the year, it might become important. The organization's MIS might be unable to provide the necessary information. You can't get everything out of the MIS, right? It could be argued that zero-based budget is far more suitable for public sector than for private sector. This is because, firstly, it is far easier to put activities into decision packages in organizations which undertake set definable activities. Local governments, for example, have set activities during the provision of housing, school, and local transport. Second, it is far more suited to protect costs that are discretionary in nature or for support activities. Such costs can be found mostly in not-for-profit organizations or the public sector or in the service department of commercial operations. So, right, that's called a zero-based budget. The next type of budgets, right, the two main budgets are what you need to know: zero-based and incremental. In addition, there are additional types of budgets, rolling budgets. A rolling budget is known as a continuous budget, a perpetual budget, or rolling time horizon budget. Now, it's like you have, in a rolling budget, you can keep planning for a period of 3 years, maybe 5 years, or even 3 months. So what happens is, after that period, you can drop the latest and add the new time period. Right? So if it's a 3-year budget, you can have a budget for 2020 budget, then 2021, 2022. And so you have your revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, expenses, and net profit. So if it's rolling budget, when it comes to the end of 2020, you drop this. And you add another year, 2023. So you have always, at any given time, you have 3 years. That's called a rolling budget. You keep rolling it. The benefit of rolling budget is that the bank's management will always have a budget that looks forward for full 1 year. A rolling budget can be used for 3 months or quarters instead of months. Also, a bank might have 5-year rolling budget for capital expenditure. In this case, a full year will be added to replace the year that has just ended. This 5-year rolling budget means the management will always have 5-year time horizon. Activity-based budgeting is a method of budgeting in which activities that incur costs in every functional area of an organization are recorded and the relationships are defined and analyzed. Activities are then tied to strategic goals, after which the cost of activities needed for use are used to create the budget. Activity-based budget can help firms create more accurate financial forecasts. Right? So it's based on each and every activity that an organization does. Right? It's maybe marketing, HR, training, all that. In contrast to cost-based budgeting practices in which a prior period's budget is simply adjusted to account for inflation or revenue growth. Activity-based budgeting opportunities to align activities with objectives, streamline costs, and improve business practices. By looking at the cost structure of an organization via the processes that are actually being performed, managers can more effectively analyze the profit potential of products and services. Cost efficiencies can be found. Right? So you need to look at the activity. Zero-based and activity budget compared. Zero-based is the method where all expenses need to be justified. Activity is the existing activity. You can look at how to improve the activity. Method where all activities that invite cost in all functional areas in an organization are recorded in the relationship between them analyzed. Zero-based budget, all functions in an organization analyzed for the needs and costs. Zero-based can be termed as re-evaluation of program and expenditure of an organization. Activity-based budgeting aligns all activities with objectives and helps effective analysis of profit potential of an organization in service and products. Right. It offers decision makers a step-by-step approach to budgeting. They can be streamlined. And the advantages are they are easy to make. Micro-level expense control can be done because you are monitoring each and every activity. You are flexible, right? You can, if certain activity is not required during a certain period, you can reallocate the funds to another activity. You rely on past data. Then you have performance-based budgeting. Performance-based budgeting use statements of mission, goal, objective to explain why money is being spent. Right? Remember, you need only to know incremental and zero-based. You don't have to know these in detail. Performance budgeting comprises three elements: the result, the final outcome, the strategy, how to achieve it, and the activity, what you need to do. It's possible to understand the activities are cost-effective in terms of achieving desired results. Right. So you can use balance scorecard, KPIs when it comes to performance-based budgeting. All right, so that's it in terms of budgeting. Thank you very much, and we will meet next week to another live session. Thank you. Stay safe. All the best.